Hello, I'm the Grug. I'm going to be talking today about Cybercraft, which is the use of cyber means to achieve your ends. And this is a skill or a function, a capability that becomes useful within the context of great power competitions that have significant exposure to cyber. And that's the world that we live in today. There's a renewed great power competition going on, and cyber is very, very much part of how we live and how sort of everything happens these days. And so Cybercraft also gives us the opportunity to look at the strategic uses of cyber capabilities, sort of not just sort of a tactical or another sort of low-level campaign thing, but sort of how a collection of campaigns can be used to advance the interests of an entity. So, that's hopefully what we're going to be able to go over. And the way that we're going to approach all of this is we're going to start out by establishing that we are in a great power competition. So, I'm going to look very briefly at that, sort of establish what that means. Then I'm going to sort of discuss what Cybercraft is and how to understand it and how to think about it and how we can use it when we're modeling and developing new ideas or new attacks or new scenarios or trying to comprehend what's happening. Then we've got neo-environ, which is basically, if we look at the way that the world is today, it's very different from how it was 20, 50, 100 years ago. And a large part of that is sort of how integrated the internet, how sort of cyber has sort of seeped into everyday life and is sort of really deeply entangled with everything that we do in modern society. And so I'm going to talk a bit about sort of, on the one hand, the evolution of the development of that, how things got more and more entangled, but also sort of what the power players are, what the structures are now that we're in this new reality. From there, we can talk a bit about strategic cyber warfare and sort of the use of cyber warfare within a strategic framework to achieve broader strategic ends or to establish policy or to further the aims of a large entity such as a state or a non-state actor. But sort of to help clarify what that is and sort of how it looks in the real world, I'm also going to do a rundown, sort of a little breakdown and examination of a bunch of actions which fall into Cybercraft. So these are like tiny little mini case studies. And then, we'll wrap it up with some parting words. So, to start out with, as I said, we're now in a great power competition, and that great power competition has been sort of established and defined by General Nakasone to say essentially that the central security challenges to the US going forward are going to be from sort of near-peer competitors. It's going to be great powers, and the locus of the struggle has moved to cyberspace, and it's away from open conflict, and it's sort of below the level of armed conflict, of armed attack. And that's very important, right? So the level of armed attack is basically the point at which you can start shooting and doing things. Whereas if it's below that, you can't actually justify shooting. So one of the things that he's sort of saying here is that the utility of cyber, that part of the reason that great powers are competing in cyberspace is that when you're in cyberspace, you are not shooting at people. So if you operate within cyberspace, sort of lower level, you are beneath armed conflict. And that's a very useful place to be, particularly if you don't want to get into a shooting war, which I would assume many people do not want to get into a shooting war. So, this is a cool thing that cyber offers us. And, again, this is sort of why we can have great power competitions because we have cyber. So a traditional great power competition would involve struggles over land for passageways or shipping lanes or whatever, and it would be constantly at the threshold of violence, and it would sometimes boil over into violence. Whereas now, the arenas that the powers are competing in, a lot of them are online, a lot of them are sort of more nebulous, like economy. And that allows a sort of very vigorous, aggressive conflict, a contest to happen in cyber, but without raising to the level of armed conflict. So this is fucking cool. So, as I said, the reason we can have great power conflicts is because we have cyber. So what does that mean? Cyber conflict, right? If we have these contests in cyber and we're attacking each other, we've got cyber conflicts, fair enough. That must mean cyber war. No, it does not mean cyber war. The reason is very simple. It's very complex, actually. So the thing is that cyber war is a concept that does not really make sense in the situation that we find ourselves today. And, a lot of the cyber war theorists are basically they're these very they're old school, they're legacy cyber theorists, cyber strategists, and their ideas are based not sort of from praxis. They don't really have a technical background. They tend to have a background in like nukes or sort of military in general, and these other things that they sort of create analogies to try and understand technology. And as a result, because they're not coming from the technology side, they don't have a deep understanding of the creativity and the freedom that is possible. Right? They have these sort of narrow visions from the analogies that they try and sort of map over, and that's fine for certain things, but it breaks your understanding in other ways. And an excellent example of this is the cyber Pearl Harbor, that was a mainstay of the CyberWar worry for a very long time. And the idea was that a adversary would attack the US and would take out the electrical grid, like here where half of Manhattan's in the dark. They'd take out the electrical grid, and that would be a strategic surprise that the US would be like, they'd be confused and surprised and caught off guard, just like they were at Pearl Harbor. And that doesn't really make sense, but sort of, I just want to follow through with one other thing, which is that the implicit understanding of this is that by having a Pearl Harbor, the cyber warfare planners are picking an analogy where they lost the first round, but they won the war. And I think that they're being disingenuous. Like, basically, that hasn't happened yet. When they've lost, they've lost, and when they've won, it hasn't been off the back of a strategic surprise where they've all sort of come together and they've done this thing, because you don't actually need to mobilize an entire country to sort of get all of the output of the industrial base of an entire country to wage a cyber war. That's just not necessary. So, cyber conflict is not a cyber war. Again, one of the reasons that this is useful is because if you were having a cyber war, you'd be sort of necessity crossing over into attacks that are sort of in the same league as an armed conflict, which would mean that you've lost a lot of the benefits of having cyber capabilities. So if you are operating in cyber and you do something that raises to the level of armed conflict, generally speaking, what you've done is you've used cyber very inefficiently to achieve a very expensive and very poor imitation of an armed attack. And in response, you're going to get the retaliation for if you had done the armed attack properly and better. So it makes no sense to me. The way that they think about these things is just it's old-fashioned and it's wrong. again, just to get back to one of the main things that makes cyber so valuable is the ability to operate below the level of armed conflict, but to achieve results typically reserved for a kinetic attack. And one of the other things about why it's not a war is that wars end, whereas cyber conflict is more like the war on drugs. It just sort of continues forever. So cyber war is not a thing, but cyber warfare is. And the reason for that is warfare describes sort of how you wage war. It's the means, the methods, the activities, sort of how you go about fighting in a conflict. So warfare is praxis. And because of that, when we're talking about conflict, we will be talking about engaging in warfare. However, the social construct, the cultural event, like there's this whole very complicated social interaction between large groups of people that is war. That doesn't make sense. That's not a thing. But, basic warfare is. And so just the one thing I want to bring up here again is, as I've said before, cyber warfare is Calvin ball. So you basically make it up as you're going along, and the only rule is you don't play it the same way twice. And this is one of the reasons that it rewards innovation very, very well. And people who stay sort of with the old paradigms don't fare particularly well in the long run. Right, that's cyber war. It doesn't exist. Cyber warfare, the praxis of war. Cyber power. So cyber power is similar to state power, except that you don't need to be a state to have it. And this is because within the cyber domain, the states do not have a monopoly on power. They do not have exclusive dominion over power. It's sort of available to anyone who can put it together or create it or whatever. So you'll get strange phenomenon like the K-pop band BTS is actually a formidable cyber power in many ways. And this is through their fandom base, ARMY. Basically, ARMY has significant cyber power that is wielded so far, there's been a bunch of stuff that they've done internally with other fandoms where there've been conflicts, and there's the voting and whatever. But what's interesting from our perspective is when the Black Lives Matter protesters were being reported by this snitch app being run by the police. There's a call that went out to ask for assistance, and ARMY responded to that, and they ended up flooding the app with a huge amount of just garbage data, like K-pop GIFs and stuff. The result was that the app had to be taken down. There's a huge bill from AWS, and it wasn't used to go after and retaliate against those those Black Lives Matter protesters. So that was an act of a decentralized non-state actor using power to affect the world by interfering with the operation of a state security force, right, which is very, very interesting if you think about it. So cyber power is in a lot of different places, and basically, if we're going to be looking at the things that go integrate power in not just the cyber age, but particularly in cyberspace, in cyber, the competition has a bunch of elements. We've sort of gone over those already. Oh, not that one. No cyber war. So you've got cyber warfare, which is sort of how the conflicts play out. You've got power, which is a broad expression of the ability to change things and how things get done. You've got Cybercraft, which sort of describes the whole process. Okay, so let's get into Cybercraft a little bit more. So the formal definition of Cybercraft mirrors the definition of statecraft. So Cybercraft is the skillful management of cyber means to achieve one's ends. What this means is that Cybercraft simply describes using cyber capabilities, cyber things, to achieve your ends, what you want. And a slightly more practical way to think about that is to just sort of focus on the mechanics of how that works. And Sarah Jane Terp came up with an excellent way of putting that, which is just Cybercraft is applied cyber power. So kind of brings us to what is cyber power. This is one definition which is useful. I don't think it's not actually ideal for the way that I tend to use cyber power, which is really very, very broad. But sort of fundamentally, cyber power is the ability to use cyber to create advantages or to influence events in other operational environments across the instruments of power. The instruments of power, you might be wondering, okay, those are dimes. So it's diplomacy, information, military, and economic. And when you're thinking about Cybercraft and how it can be used, actually these four elements, this dime, is very, very useful because it sort of shows you the different ways that you can approach using cyber power to achieve your ends. There's sort of like a military way, there's an economic way, there's just using information, and then there's sort of straight up diplomacy and a sort of negotiations and helping each other out and stuff. So there's a lot of different ways that you can affect things, and it's not all warfare, and it's not all information operations, it's not all stealing IP and stuff. There's a lot of things that go into there, and you've got a lot of different ways that you can think about using this. And there's, because Cybercraft is such a complicated, it's an easy concept, but it's a complex thing. There's a lot of different ways that you can understand it and think about it. And one of them is the 4 layers of war. And the 4 layers of war, basically, you've got your political, which is at the very top, where someone says, all right, we need to invade that country. That's the political decision. Then you've got the strategic, which is sort of just below that, which says, all right, invading that country, how would we go about doing that to achieve success in the fastest time with the fewest resources and whatever, within our parameters that have been set. So the strategic level sort of figures out how to do things, sets objectives, and then sort of drops it down to the operational level, which is where you start executing. The operational level is this level that sort of, it's not quite tactical, you're not actually engaged in conflict at it, it's sort of managing all of those things, but it's not strategic because it's no longer trying to evaluate and create means of achieving objectives and stuff like that. It's just sort of managing all this stuff through. And it's actually a very, very important part of a lot of things. Like I've spoken about operational art in cybercrime, and it's one of the best ways to gain an edge, is to have much better operations. Anyway, and then so you've got political, strategic, operational, and then tacticals. Actually, it's a sort of low level, actually doing things. So it's useful to have this sort of 4 layers in mind, and then understand that when you talk about Cybercraft, it fits really well at the strategic layer, because it's sort of you're looking at how you can use cyber means to achieve your ends. The strategic layer is when you've been given your ends and you have to find ways of achieving them. The political layer is sort of above that, where you're sort of deciding what you want. But by the time you've got to the strategic layer, that's when Cybercraft sort of really starts to shine and have a lot to offer. And then as you go down with operational and tactical, you're still sort of within cyber, and still Cybercraft is there, but it's, it starts at the top with strategic. It's really good there. And again, there's a lot of different ways of understanding and thinking about it. So you've got your frameworks like DIME, which we sort of went over, which is sort of like the character of what you're doing, of how you're, of the effects that you are creating. So you've got your diplomacy, your information, your military, and your economic. You also have PESTLE, which is sort of, it's the impact, sort of like it allows you to sort of parse and understand how your things are going to impact on your target. And there we have politics, economics, society, technology, environment, and legal. So if you've got these things in mind, you sort of really get a good concept of different ways that Cybercraft can be used and applied in your situation. And if we're speaking about that, what is the situation? So, the new environment where we now live, it's sort of, before we dive right into that, I need to sort of explain what infrastructure is, because infrastructure is a critical part of understanding what we're in, but also infrastructure is not just sort of, it's not just dead things. It's not physical artifacts. It's not like just the roadway by itself. It's not plumbing. It's not the power lines, right? The infrastructure is actually, it's created by the interaction of sort of the users and the humans and the people maintaining it and people using it, and the physical stuff itself. So infrastructure is sort of this living, breathing thing. It's got not just the raw bits that make it work. It's got a lot that goes into it, including how it's being used, and like the little quirks that you have to learn about, and when it breaks down, how you can fix it, and if you need to improve it, how you go about doing that, and what it's been built on, and all this other stuff. So infrastructure is a very critical concept here, and I'm going to sort of run through some of the things about it, but basically the core thing, is this definition from Lay. Infrastructure is not only a descriptive term for large-scale and extensive physical artifacts, it's a quality in its own right, something achieved by work, performed both by technologies and by the humans who attend them. So it's this interaction between all of this stuff, the people and the technology and all that creates infrastructure. And sort of the experience of infrastructure, like the elements of what goes into infrastructure defines it, is that it's embedded. So it's embedded inside social relationships and structures, and also inside like sort of actual objects and stuff. And because it's embedded and sort of it's part of this deep thing, it's very hard for outsiders to tell what is like infrastructure and what is not. So, okay. So it's embedded, it's transparent. So the thing is, when it's working, it's invisible. You don't see it. It doesn't really exist. The only time it shows up is when it breaks. Similarly, it has broad reach. Infrastructure is not just one event, one site, one specific thing. It's a range of things together that a lot of people can use in a lot of different places. Learning infrastructure sort of indicates membership to a group. It can be necessary to join in a subculture, for example, like IRC back in the 90s. So if you had to learn how it worked, and then you could be part of the community, and IRC was just an infrastructure. There's sort of communities of practice. Basically, the people that use it, sort of, they forget that they're relying on it. It's right, so you get like links with conventions of practice. So once you sort of learn, and this is how things are done, then once you know sort of the way that the infrastructure expects things to work, when you encounter other things, you sort of reuse that. You expect it to be similar. So it creates a sort of culture. And like it's supposedly made up of a set of standards so that you can create things that interrelate and hook up with it. And one of the ways of understanding infrastructure is that it's actually the embodiment of those standards. Like you've got the actual standards that are sort of written down or whatever, then you've got what's really implemented, and those are the real standards. And that's infrastructure. And then sort of the parts that go in and comprise infrastructure are sort of very, very broadly. You've got it's built on an installed base. It's only really visible when it breaks down, and when you fix it, you have to do it in modular increments. You can't treat the whole thing at once. Why is that interesting? Well, because a lot of times you'll see people talk about critical national infrastructure. And the thing about critical national infrastructure is it's critical, it's maintained at the national level, but it's basically just subsistence, right? It keeps the body alive. It's not sufficient for modern society as we know it to operate. And this is because we need a lot more infrastructure for modern society to function. And it's revealed by the depth of integration that we have with cyberspace. So, if we look at what happens when the power grid goes out, it is, of course, terrible. But it's a bounded annoyance that we can sort of get over and get beyond. Whereas if we were to look at if we didn't have phones anymore, you would see it's actually incredibly painful. Like, so much of what we expect is built on the way that we use this infrastructure, and we've come to rely on it and to sort of expect what it gives us. So, this critical national infrastructure, it's fine if we're talking about like the basic necessities of life, your utilities, your transport, your groceries, that sort of thing. It's these physiological requirements. That's A-okay, but it's not what we need to sort of self-actualize as human beings. And one way we can sort of explore this is by looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the bottom you've got sort of like this physiological and these safety requirements. That's where national infrastructure tends to sort of come in, right? It's absolutely critical. Yes, you need to breathe air, you need to have food, you need to be warm, you need to have water, you need to sleep, all this stuff. But if you're just sort of living at that level, it's not really living, right? It's not what we would sort of aspire to. Instead, we come up with critical cyber infrastructure, and this is sort of where everything that not everything, but most of what we understand of modern society, it exists at these higher layers of Maslow's hierarchy. And sort of part of the fascinating thing about that is that cyberspace has sort of become enmeshed in real life, but it's also sort of blurred. It's no longer a separate thing. It's a sort of part of how we live, how we go about doing stuff. So, a lot of complex social functions actually rely heavily on cyberspace. So, these days people need Facebook to organize parties. You need your phone to arrange meeting up with friends because, the ability to say everyone be at the same bar at 7:30, that no longer exists. People have Tinder and Grindr and that to meet mates because that's how things work now. That's just the society that we become, is one that is codependent on cyber. And where this sort of leads us is the idea that, the idea that the internet is somehow separate from, where we are, that there's an internet space, and then there's our existence, that these are separate things. That's sort of false because it's so intertwined and connected. So, it's fair to say that there's no notable distinction between the internet and the real world. In a modern society, the amount of integration and interreliance is so high that if you are completely removed from the internet, you have a very hard time functioning in society. And sort of, this is because the internet has merged with everyday life. But, it's something the really cool cyberpunk way that we were sort of looking forward to and anticipating in the 90s or the late 80s and stuff. We had this cool idea of how things were going to be, and instead of that, we sort of got this messy, crappy thing. Stuff that falls over, things that have surveillance capital built into them, things that are sort of like they're crippled in their functionality, things that are too expensive, stuff that doesn't quite do what you want. It's not as awesome as it should have been. And sort of what that means in a way is what we have is this cyber terrain that has actually been built up, that we actually use, is not super awesome and cool like we wanted it to be. It's actually quite different. So I'm just going to go sort of briefly through a history of the things that made up cyber domains, the cyber terrain, and where they are now and what we are at now. Right, so this is, if we're just going through a very brief history, we start out sort of like with Lenin is speaking into a gramophone to make a recording for a mass broadcast. Then we've got sort of the plug lines for telephone communications, where it had to sort of be manually, lines had to be plugged together. Sort of that was a step up. Then there's the an IBM computer. Obviously, it's quite big, and it's being operated by someone. As you'll see, like these pictures of infrastructure are they're not objects; they are people interacting with these objects. And then finally, at the culmination, you have Lenin using a laptop to spread the message, and that is sort of. That's part of it. Obviously, the next step would be using a mobile phone, but I don't have a picture of that. So, to start out with, the critical communications infrastructure that we had, that people were using, was the telegraph. And those telegraph wires that connected the world, they went through Cornwall in England, the south of England. And this was around, this was before World War I, and they were still there during World War I. And the Germans actually still sent their telegraphs through the UK, through England, which allowed the British to read, the traffic of the Germans. And that was very, very useful, particularly with the Zapruder telegram, which they used to get the Americans to join the war. Then, sort of like after the telegraph wires, you had the telephone lines of Ma Bell, of the Bell telephone. And there, the entity that controlled the lines was able to monitor and not just monitor the traffic, but could actually reroute it and send it to different places. So, to be powerful then, you had to sort of be Ma Bell. And then following on from that, we sort of had like the internet access at home or at sort of basic data centers and stuff like that. And there, what you have is the the locus of power in the communications infrastructure is being where these networks meet up, where they have to route together, where they peer. So that became the place to be, to have access to everything that was going around. And this was sort of made possible by the fact that we lived in a very open world back then. All of the protocols that we used to communicate were in plain text. POP3, SMTP, HTTP, IMAP, all this stuff. It was just it was in plain text, could be read off the wire easily. But where we've moved since then is sort of this modern era where we don't have an open world anymore. What we have is these the ecosystems, the polities, networks, and giants. And sort of when you connect to something, that's it. You become part of that. The power is located within the entity that controls that communication, because it doesn't travel anywhere else and it's not available anywhere else. It is very literally just, right there. You have to be there. So things have changed from the telegraph to the telephone to peering to now it's centralized. And sort of where that comes in next, that's sort of integrated with that, is the 5G network, the 5G system. And essentially what's happened is, because China made a grand strategy decision, they made a policy decision, political, to own 5G, and they put everything into it, and they spent a decade plus working to make sure that they were well positioned to control 5G, or to at least be part of the 5G future. And no one else did that, right? Everyone else sort of left it to economic incentives by these companies, a lot of whom were going out of business, to sort of make sure that they went in and they sort of had to do this stuff on their own. China did it as a nation. Everyone else sort of left it up to the individual companies, and this is sort of why nowadays, if you want 5G, you are sort of stuck with Huawei or nothing. Like they had the strategic position early on, and that's sort of allowed them to dominate going forward. And so that's sort of the network that it's on, the base ecosystem. But then in terms of the mobile devices and the software and hardware, the hardware is sort of all over the map. But the software, you've only really got two options. You've got Android and iOS, and again, these two things sort of provide their own polities, their own sort of groups, right? Like if you're part of iOS, then you have Apple provides you security and updates and all the stuff. And if you're part of Android, then it sort of depends on which vendor you went with and all this other stuff. So you've got these ecosystems which are different from how it used to be when we had an open network, but it's not quite at the level of a Twitter or a Facebook or a WhatsApp, where it's sort of all self-contained. All right, more about the blah, blah, blah. More about the hardware and stuff. Huawei on everything. Okay, web apps and native apps. This is the next sort of interesting thing that came up. And that's because they've created these sort of polities. They're self-contained communities, networks. They've got everything inside of them. So if you join Twitter and you become part of a particular group or community, you're sort of operating within a polity. If you're in Reddit, you have your subreddits, and those are their own communities and their own cultures and everything. Same with WeChat or VK, YouTube, Facebook. All of these things create a space where you can have communities. And this is somewhat similar, but not exactly the same, for communications networks such as Zoom or Signal, WhatsApp, Telegram, etc. So, like as we've moved from this, Britain controls all the telegraphs to everyone sort of controls their own thing, like it's Facebook controls everything and whatever. As we've moved to that, one of the things that's sort of being left next to the side is these actual communications networks, and those become very useful for the other communities and cultures that need to speak with each other and communicate, but they don't form their own cultures. Telegram is slightly different because they've got groups, right? Then, of course, like we mentioned, there's like all of these various companies that have their things, and you've got your cultures and your polities, your social environments. The next thing that shows up is giants, and these giants are huge. Like their sheer existence warps the physics of the domain that they inhabit. So, Google, Baidu, Tencent, Yandex, these things are they shape the nature of cyber by their very presence, the way that they are and what they do. They literally change how things work. And they're not state entities. They have huge amounts of power. They have more power than a state. As I've said, if they were states, they would actually have less power because they'd be constrained. As they are, they're sort of free to do as they will. And that makes them even more powerful than a state. Next, sort of what's happened is these load-bearing sections of society, the things that allow us to be a successful, cultured community, that sort of enable actual modern society as we know it. Our social networks, our communications, the finances, the arts, the fourth estate, newspapers and all that. These are all deeply connected to cyber, right? These no longer exist independent. These are all deeply intertwined. They're all heavily part of cyber. They're all reliant on cyber. And this is sort of quite cool because what we've gone from is the sort of nationally controlled international communications infrastructure to basically private polities, networks, these cosmic giants, these sort of individual entities. Some of them are state, some of them are non-state, some of them are sort of completely anarchic and everything. But they now control all of these things that used to be controlled by nations, exclusively by nations, I should say. So the side effect of one of those is that once we've all moved to these non-state, we've moved out of these nationally controlled international communications systems, we've now actually slipped outside of the surveillance cone of the security services because they do not have access into all of these different polities. They don't have the same level of awareness and control and access that they would do if it was just national level infrastructure. So cyber terrain is huge in sort of understanding it and understanding that this is sort of where modern society exists. Sort of how came to be is this growth from national infrastructure to now private infrastructure. And the cyber infrastructure is actually possibly more important to modern society than some of the sort of critical national infrastructure things like, we need cyber a huge amount, and that's not really grasped or understood, particularly because the things that we need are not banking apps necessarily, but it could be things that are frivolous, like Facebook. Like why would we need to just talk to our friends? How's that critical? And it's like, well, it's like that's society, man. Like you actually need that to function. So that's the cyber terrain. That's sort of the environment that we're in, the new normal. Now we can look at sort of cyber warfare in theory, particularly at a strategic level. And this is a bit difficult to sort of understand because a lot of the APT stuff is not as sophisticated and cool as we would like it to be. So here you've got APT conducting a sophisticated attack. So cyber warfare, as we said earlier, it's the methods, the capabilities, and the techniques that are used to wage warfare. And we see these in the news all the time. We see the actual impact, the actual effects of cyber warfare as it's happening, and it doesn't match up with the idea of a cyber Pearl Harbor or any of these sort of other, turning out the lights, taking out the banking systems. It doesn't match these things. It turns out to be, having Twitter bots that change the trending stuff, hacking and leaking emails, just sort of being assholes to people until they stop being polite to their friends online, trolling. These are not the things that the experts were telling us were going to be part of warfare, but these are the things that actually are part of warfare that we see happening. So one of the things to think about is that it's got a lot of different stuff. The ways that it can impact and sort of the areas that it can affect. You've got your cognitive domain, the informational, the physical, and the digital. And as I said earlier, the layers of war. You've got politics, strategy, operations, tactics, and the types of effects. These are going to be all of your Ds: your deny, destroy, degrade, disrupt, deceive, discombobulate. It's a real one, by the way. This is sort of how cyber warfare is supposed to do the stuff and how it impacts things. And that's true, but we also see a lot of sort of creativity and different things happening. What we don't see is there we go. We don't see this. We don't see a sort of, a bunch of electricity just getting shut off arbitrarily. Like that's not how cyber warfare actually works in the real world. And one of the reasons for this is, I'm going to talk about the Clausewitz Trinity, which sort of explains what warfare sort of actually is how it happens. And, I've said Clausewitz, drink. So when we talk about Clausewitz, the Trinity, what we're talking about is the sentence that he wrote, which is, warfare is composed of the primordial violence, hatred, and enmity, which are to be regarded as blind natural force, of the play of chance and probability within which the creative spirit is free to roam, and of its element of subordination as an instrument of policy, which makes it subject to reason. So from all of that, the sort of the three things that govern war or warfare are enmity, chance, and reason. And this is from Prussian von Clausewitz, from his famous book, Quite a Lot of Writing on War for Someone Who Never Actually Went, or On War for short. And this is this sort of enmity, chance, reason. These gives us the three legs of war, which is the people, the army, and the government. And the people are like the enmity. They desire war. They hate the other. So the thing is, they're the ones who pay the material cost for waging war. They anticipate the material gains if they win. And sort of what keeps them going is the emotions and morale. Like, they're not benefiting in any immediate way. They're suffering a lot, but they have this emotional need to wage war. Then you have the army, which is, again, we're not talking about literally the physical army and excluding the Navy. What we're talking about is, this includes industry and, other things like that. It's basically the ability to wage war. So a nation's ability to wage war, which includes like its finances and stuff. But all of this stuff tends to be sort of physical. It's, like the soldiers, the physical supplies, the material, all of the stuff that sort of gets fed into war and destroyed. And the thing is, war basically needs to be, it consumes a huge amount. So you have to keep feeding it. And the side that ceases to be able to feed it loses, right? So you have to keep feeding it longer than the other side. And that's called Materialschlacht, which is the contest of material, right? And then you have the government. These are the drivers behind war. This is the reason, and they're supposed to be the rational reason that the conflict is happening. Saying like, we need to control that area of territory. We need to have security on our southern border or whatever. And the idea is that basically the leaders they extract resources from the people to turn into material and personnel that they feed to Mars via the army. And as long as they're in power and they're extracting resources, that just keeps going on indefinitely. And these dynamics of like the people, the army, the leaders, sort of gives us two of the ways that wars can be decided. This is not battles, this is wars. So these are decided by the Battle of Material, which is Materialschlacht. So this is if one side runs out of tanks before the other side, they lose. So in a sort of a battle of attrition, this tends to be what you're trying to do, is you're trying to wear out the other side's supply of material. But the other way is Moralschlacht, which is the battle of morale. So if the other side loses the will to fight, then they lose as well. So as we look at warfare, there's sort of these two different ways of achieving success. One is by destroying all of the other stuff, and the other one is by destroying the will to fight. And cyber actually is amazingly good at Moralschlacht. You can sort of get into and mess around with people's psyches and morale and what to fight in that. So broadly speaking, wars matter, not battles. Battles they're not really decisive. The battles are won by the first side to make the other guy's side stop fighting. But wars are won by the side that does not give up. Right, the side that sort of has resources and energy and desire to keep fighting, that is the side that wins. So if you look at Vietnam, sort of overall, the U.S. lost the desire. Like the Materialschlacht was won by the North Vietnamese, and as a result, the US ceased to desire the war. They no longer had interest in it, whereas the North Vietnamese never lost that. As a result, the end was sort of a foregone conclusion. It took years to get there, but the US was done. Like they were leaving, it was over, and that was a conflict that was won at the morale level. And so, morale is actually very, very powerful. It seems like it's not, but it does win wars. And the downside, of course, as long as there's people who want to fight and they have some means of fighting them, then they will fight. So crushing that it's non-trivial. So just sort of briefly, war is an endurance event. It's a duration activity. It's not a sort of short thing. You can't do short wars. They don't happen. And that's because battles don't decide things. It's wars, and wars are won by exhausting the material or the morale of the other side. And, fortunately, cyber actually gives you a way to exhaust the morale of the other side without being engaged directly in a physical kinetic combat. So that's something to think about. I actually don't have time to go over the actions that I have here, so I'm really gonna blaze through these. So this is in 2016. We had the Russian IRA. They ran these social media trolling campaigns. They had huge online communities that they radicalized, and quite a lot of them are still going now, even without the Russians maintaining and supporting them. And that's a long-term success that they achieved. They had a lot of very influential personas that they controlled that allowed them to sort of guide the discourse in a lot of ways. The GRU, they hacked a lot of servers, they collected a lot of emails, they sorted them, they clustered them, they collated and arranged them to form narratives. And then, they suffered a minor setback when they were exposed early, and they recovered from that by creating this persona Guccifer2 and getting that sort of up and running in less than 24 hours, which is an absolutely amazing feat of intelligence engineering. This is great espionage. They were able to turn around from a blown operation into an influence op overnight. Very, very well done. But they also learned a lot of lessons. So they learned that actually they couldn't do hack and leaks by themselves because no one cared. They didn't have an audience, they didn't have authenticity, they didn't have a channel. They couldn't actually get the data that they were leaking to anyone that gave a shit. So it's a lot more complex than it seems on the surface. And once they had enlisted WikiLeaks, who initially just sort of did these mass drops, like during DNC, they did a mass drop. They learned to actually shape the media narrative by controlling the amount of information that they were leaking. So they ended up doing this drip feed, and they controlled an entire month of coverage rather than just 2 or 3 days. So WikiLeaks learned how to be more effective at doing information operations, and people learned from them, but they burned their credibility in the process, and it's unlikely that that technique can be used directly again. Certainly not by WikiLeaks, because he's going to jail. But in general, that sort of technique has been burned, and this is why, as I said, it's Calvin ball. You can't play it the same way twice. So there needs to be a new approach that builds on that and does it differently. And there actually has been one, and it was much more effective, but I don't have time to get into it today. It's absolutely amazing. So some of the other ones, so there's the shadow brokers, where they released stolen NSA exploits and tools, and even data from actual operations. So this had a very long-running impact. 2016, 17, to 18, it was still causing problems. And this is sort of amazing because not only did they screw around with NSA, they remained in the public, they remained operational, they were still doing things for the better part of a year, even though the NSA was directly looking for them. That's pretty amazing. That's a huge accomplishment. And they were never caught, they were never attributed. We still don't know who it was. It could have been literally any Russian. It could have been anyone. So those are some cyber actions that have sort of taken place. If we look at the US Cybercom, they've also engaged in actions which they view as being sort of cybercraft. They see as using cyber to achieve the political ends, the goals of the state. And for them, that's been sort of contesting ISIL in the information space. So they went and they deleted a whole bunch of ISIL online accounts, and they took down forums, and they deleted a whole bunch of saved pictures and data and stuff that was going to be used, and they deleted the licenses for the software and things like that. So that's almost as cool as winning an election, or destroying the NSA stuff. I mean, that's pretty cool. Going after a bunch of peasants in Iraq. So Cybercom was very, very pleased with themselves with this. They in their after-action assessment, they said that they had successfully contested ISIL in the information space. Other people who are familiar with that had their own assessments, and they were less excited, shall we say. They felt that it was sort of not a particularly impressive thing, and it wasn't done very well, and it didn't last very long, that the ISIL was able to recover fairly quickly. So, I guess if you're doing a humble brag, maybe a bit more humble, a little less brag, it's not a bad idea. So, in conclusion, as important in going away, just to briefly recap, Cybercraft, it's the skillful use of cyber means to achieve one's end. It's sort of the application of cyber power is one way to think about it. So Cybercraft sort of gives you the ability to think about the use of cyber as a strategic capability that can be used to achieve something above and beyond simply the low level of hacking or defacing or leaking things. Those are sort of low level tactical things. You can actually do a lot more to achieve your objectives through cyber. Right, and so one of the things that makes Cybercraft particularly useful is because it operates in cyber, it's below the level of armed conflict, which means that you can do a lot more that has a lot of impact without ever risking a kinetic response, without actually risking going to war. So that's very useful. And then we're in an era of great power competition. We're going to have these sort of cyber conflicts are constant. They're going to be happening everywhere. Things are going to be showing up in the news, that won't really make sense out of context, but for the participants, they will know, these are the results of enemy action and things like that. So I wanted to just sort of cover the 4 ways, the 4 layers of warfare, but sort of let that go. The sort of final thought that I want to leave you with is that statecraft is not going anywhere. There's still the need for states to do things between each other and negotiate and all this stuff. But it's being joined now by Cybercraft, and Cybercraft is available to sort of anyone. It's not the exclusive domain of states. So we're going into an interesting time now where there's a lot of ability for sort of almost anyone to contest nations and do it at a level below conflict and achieve results that might be only available kinetically otherwise. So I leave you with that. So statecraft is not going anywhere, but Cybercraft is joining it. Finn. Okay, thank you. I'll be around for questions, and here are the references. You can get them off the slides later.